Hello, Mayor Fry. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Hi, proud Papa.
Hey.
Congratulations.
Good to see you. Tony, Andrea, how are you?
Yeah. What? Mazel tov.
Oh, duh. Thank
And
you.
thank you for being here.
Proud.
Yes.
Yeah.
Hi, Mayor. Thank you so much, and congratulations again.
Thank you, Tony. It is exciting, a life-changing event, that's for sure.
Yes, I'm sure.
All right, it is 4:30. I'll go ahead and press the record button. I'll give you your cue, and then you can begin.
Okay, great.
This meeting is being recorded and/or transcribed.
The work group will now begin.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this virtual meeting of the Charter Commission's Public Safety Work Group. This meeting includes the remote participation of members as authorized under Minnesota State Statute Section 13D.021 due to the declared local health pandemic. For the record, my name is Tony Newborn, and I am one of the co-chairs along with Commissioner Rubenstein of the Charter Commission's Public Safety Work Group. I will now call this meeting to order and ask the clerk to call the roll so that we may verify the presence of a quorum.
Commissioner Kozak. Commissioner Perry.
Here.
Commissioner Sandberg.
Here.
Commissioner Schwarzkopf.
Present.
Chair Clegg.
Here.
Commissioner Rubenstein.
Here.
Commissioner Kozak. Commissioner Newborn.
Here.
We have 6 members present and 1 absent.
Great. Let the record reflect we have a quorum. We will now proceed to our agenda, a copy of which was posted for public access to the city's Legislative Information Management System, which is available at lims.minneapolismn.gov. Now moving to the adoption of the agenda. Commissioners, the agenda for today's meeting is before us. May I please have a motion to adopt the agenda?
Motion, Sandberg.
Schwarzkopf.
Great. Is there any discussion before the clerk calls the roll? With that, seeing none, I'll ask the clerk to call the roll on the motion.
Commissioner Kozak.
Here.
Aye.
Well, aye. Are we aye?
Commissioner Perry.
Aye.
Commissioner Sandberg.
Aye.
Commissioner Schwarzkopf.
Aye.
Chair Clegg.
Aye.
Commissioner Rubenstein.
Aye.
Commissioner Newborn.
Aye.
There are 7 ayes.
Great. That motion passes and the agenda is adopted. Moving on to the agenda, item 1 on the agenda is the chair's report. And I believe that we don't have a report at this point in time. Is that correct, Commissioner and Chair Rubenstein?
Yes, sir, correct.
Awesome. So then we will move to item 2 on the agenda. As you all know, we have invited guests here to answer questions regarding our Minneapolis Police Department reforms now pending or in place, and details about the effects of the 2019 co-responder program. Our invited guests are Mayor Jacob Fry, NPD Chief Madara Arredondo, and NPD Deputy Chief Eric Ford. Thank you again so much, Mayor and Chief and Deputy Chief, for attending our meeting here today. Mayor, we understand that you have some time constraints, and so we want to dive into the questions if there's no any discussion or thought. Okay, hearing none, let's dive straight into the questions, and they'll be directed first towards the mayor, and for the other panelists, feel free to jump in as needed. So we've sent you the questions in advance, and Casey Clark, Carl, our clerk, has sent over the questions to you all. Question number one that we have is, from your perspective, and specifically your leadership position, what, if any, barriers or obstacles does the current charter impose to police reform and accountability? Opportunities for interdepartmental partnerships and alternatives to public safety service delivery.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair, for the question. Thank you, all the Charter Commission members, for having us here today. I know that you've been undergoing a substantial amount of work, as have we over at City Hall, for both a shift in culture and form, but also obviously public safety as well. So there are a number of barriers that exist to the kinds of reform and accountability measures that we need to see. Many of them we've recently outlined actually to the state through the process that we have that is presently being undergone with them through the TRO. Much of it is actually in state law. I've spoken in extent about the difficulty with the arbitration system, the mandatory arbitration system, which, you know, we go through a grievance process along with the union. We go through a process that usually takes quite some time, and the end result, assuming it gets that far, is a mandatory arbitration proceeding, and that arbitration proceeding will return about 50% of the cases back to the Minneapolis Police Department. So these are instances of either discipline or termination, where we, the chief or I, felt strongly that there needed to be a disciplinary action taken. And like I said, 50% of the time, approximately, that decision is overturned. It is a major impediment when the chief or I are making decisions about our disciplinary matrix. It's a major impediment to shifting the culture of the Minneapolis Police Department, and it does need to change. There's a number of other statutes that are also in existence at the state level that in many cases inhibit change. One of them was recently shifted by the bill passed in the most recent session, and that was the use of force and use of deadly force statute. Since that statute was shifted, while we still are obviously preempted by state law, the limitations as far as how we were to draft our own use of force policy became more lenient and allowed us to go further than we had before. And so we immediately crafted and updated and did a full-on overhaul, actually, of our use of force policy. And there's a number of items that I think were important to shift within that. Notably, officers are now required to consider all reasonable alternatives explicitly within the policy before they resort to deadly force. Now, within the charter itself, obviously the charter itself calls for a Minneapolis Police Department, as it does call for other departments to be present at the city. The charter also has a mandatory minimum number of officers, as you know, that is determined by a formula. And, you know, other than that, there aren't major impediments to making decisions at City Hall. Many of those impediments either come through the collective bargaining agreement and or statutory.
Thank you so much, Mayor. Chief Arredondo, do you have any thoughts or additions?
No, thank you, Madam Chair, again for having us here. No, I concur with the mayor. As he mentioned, there's a couple of different processes going on. One is obviously from the Minnesota Department of Human Rights, that temporary restraining order work, and we've been involved quite extensively since that was launched first part of June. Everything from, as the mayor mentioned, policy changes, some bans on certain policies. We've also been updating our own policies and taking the initiative, and quite frankly, I think we're leading in many areas in terms of some of those critical policy changes that we have done. And so we'll continue to keep going on that route, but no, I would concur with the mayor's statement.
Okay. Great. And Mayor, I think you've covered some of these things, but I'm going to ask the second question. From your perspective, what, if any, improvements or changes to the current charter will help to advance or support police reform and accountability, looking at opportunities for those partnerships and alternatives to public safety service delivery? What particularly needs attention?
And the question is specifically about the charter, just to be clear?
Yes, Mayor.
Yeah, I think for the most part, I've already covered them. The most obvious piece is the mandatory minimum itself that is presently within the charter. And you can fall on either side of the argument as to whether we need more officers or fewer officers, but this particular piece is within the charter itself. And there's no legal necessity in having it there.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Mayor. Chief Arredondo, anything to add to that?
No, I'm good with that. Okay. I noticed there was something, opportunities for interdepartmental partnerships. I just know that even aside from the charter, those have been engagements that we've been currently working on for quite some time too. Okay.
And which departments are you working with specifically?
Madam Chair, the MPD, we've been working quite extensively with, through the Office of Violence Prevention, OVP. We've been working quite a lot with Director Sasha Cotton and a lot of the work that she's been doing in terms of community outreach, recognizing the importance in some spaces for different alternatives to policing. And so whether it's we'll probably go into it a little bit later, but whether it's the group violence intervention model, we've been working on other types of outreach with her, whether it's dealing with some of the addiction issues in our communities they're facing. Working with our youth is a huge core group that we're continuing to try to provide some outreach and support our other partners like the Office of Violence Prevention. Public Health is another one. CPAD, there's a lot of other different agencies within the city enterprise we will continue to partner with.
Okay, great. Thank you both for your responses. Moving to the third question, according to the city attorney, the city council maintains the same policy authority over the police department that it has over other departments. It seems to us, as we have been interviewing various city officials and conducting our own research, that one key to transforming the police culture in this city is for the mayor and city council to work together in cooperation and concert on policy issues and changes. What can you do to help make this happen?
Madam Chair, should I start off?
Yes, Mayor.
Yeah, he seems kind of nuts.
So, I'm realizing also now that I failed to answer the second part of your last question, but I think I can fold it in pretty well here. Okay. I think there are many points. Yeah. There are many points of agreement. Points of agreement between the mayor and the city council. Points of agreement between staff and departments. One of the big ones is aspects of safety beyond policing. Some of the work that, right now we've got a number of partnerships that are happening that are run through our city coordinator's office, including a 911 work group determining which 911 calls need to have response by an officer with a gun, and which perhaps 911 calls can be diverted to other mechanisms, whether that's some form of mental health worker, social worker, or reg services, or even have many of these calls shifted over to 311, which is something that, in fact, we're already doing now. And additionally, I think there's very clear agreement that we need to be addressing the systemic inequities that we see in policing and throughout our city. And part of that, is looking at and seeing how we can have perhaps a new approach, and that includes increased funding and resources for safety beyond policing. And one example is the 2.5 million new additional dollars that we have for an ongoing basis that will be in the 2021 budget for the violence interrupter model. And that'll be through the Office of Violence Prevention. It's moving the Office of Violence Prevention itself out into community. It's transferring some of the calls from 911 over to 311. It's finding other outlets where we can make sure that our police officers can focus on crime and serious crimes, and making sure that other calls can be diverted to other individuals who are perhaps more quick to timestamp. So those are just a couple of examples of some of the work, and I think just an overarching acknowledgement that so many of these issues go so far and well beyond the crime itself or the police officer's response. And that's everything from affordable housing to growing our economy through inclusion, to employment opportunities, dignified pay. Our chief has discussed these items in extent, noting the impact they ultimately have on crime as well.
Well,
thank you so much. I'm just working my way off of mute. I just want to remind everyone, if you could please mute your computers or phones. We're hearing some background noise coming through. Mayor, just as a follow-up, in particular with the relationship with the city council and your office, in addition to in working with the chief, what are some ways, from and all of the things that you talked about, the work that you're doing and working with the health department and some of the initiatives that you have, where is is there a partnership with council as it relates to this work?
I think the answer is yes. Based on verbiage that's oftentimes used, the chasm seems much larger than it actually is in reality. And, when people say, for instance, the word defund, they mean many, many different things depending on who you talk to. And that's why I'm very careful to say specifically what I mean. If we're talking about safety beyond policing, count me in. If we're talking about decriminalizing addiction, I'm on board. If we're talking about making sure that we have necessary accountability and that we have officers concentrated and focused on crime and violent crime, that's what I think we absolutely need to do, and there's full unity there. I've made very clear on kind of where I draw the line, but I think there's a ton of room for negotiations and collaboration, really, to be more specific about getting a lot of these elements done. And if you look, and I think I'm going to address some of the 2021 budget in a few questions down, so I don't want to get into that too much here right now. But these are elements that I think there is broad support for.
Great, thank you, Mayor. Chief Arredondo, is there any additions that you would like to make?
No, I would just, Madam Chair, I would just say that in terms of the relationship that even I can help play in support of the mayor with the city council is just education, awareness. I know that there are often times things that occur within our organization, whether from a policy level, training perspective, our engagement with our communities. Certainly our 13 city council members have their constituents in the many different wards throughout our city. I think just continuing to make sure that our folks are leaning in, providing awareness, education, updates to our city council, their aides, and where we can collaborate together. I think that will continue to help us move community safety forward.
Okay, great. I'm going to move to the next question, starting with the mayor. Are there any points of agreement between the council and the mayor? And if so, what are they? And Mayor, I will say that you touched on a few of those. So if you don't have anything else to add, we can move to the next question. But if you do, feel free to take this time.
Thanks for the question. I think I mainly covered it already. I'm sure there are other items of agreement that I failed to mention, but I think we hit some of the main pieces. And I do think everyone wants to see transformation and full-on change within our MPD. I think everyone also wants to make sure that everyone in our city is safe. And those are two big pieces. And yeah, there are at times diverging notions of how we get there. But, you know, I've been talking with council members, and especially over the last couple of weeks, I'm finding that there's mass agreement in the direction that we've been looking to go. And I've also been in constant collaboration with the chief, and he and I are lockstep.
Great. As a follow-up, Mayor, you know, we've talked to we've talked to the council members and other folks as well, and related to this, the relationship that the mayor's office and you specifically have with the council. Do you see a difference between how, and with the police as well, how the relationship with yourself, police, and the council versus other departments? There seems to be at least some of the information that we've received or statements that we've received is that there's a difference between how police interacts with council versus how other departments interact with council, and where your office fits into that. I hope my question makes sense.
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, I'll let the chief speak for interactions with the council, but from a procedural and legal standpoint, the main difference is that the chief of police reports to me. And I've made very clear that I think that is the right decision. Most every other major city in the entire country has that model. And to the extent I mean, there was a lot of talk a couple years ago about, you know, many cities having a model that was being proposed at the time by the council. And as was pointed out, that was false. Completely false. The reason that it is, I believe that it's the right decision to have the chief report exclusively to the mayor is that, one, you need accountability. When things go wrong, or right for that matter, you need to have someone that is taking responsibility for it. And in that case, it's the chief and it's the mayor. I would be very concerned about having 14 different bosses and the finger pointing going 14 different directions and 14 different opinions, which we've very clearly seen. You know, there are different perspectives, and that's not a bad thing. That is just a nature of government. That's a nature of a legislative body, and due to that, I think that it makes most sense to have that authority vested in the individuals that are ultimately responsible, and in this case, it's the chief and the mayor. So that is a point of disagreement, at least among some of the council members. But many, it's a point of agreement, you know, and you know, there are other elements that were considered as part of the most recent charter amendment where I think there is agreement. I mean, we mentioned the notion of the minimum number, the minimum number required in the charter just a bit ago. But no, I am confident that there's a whole lot more unity than perhaps has been portrayed at times. There are important differences of opinion as well, and I think that it's necessary that we hash them out in a respectful manner.
Great, thank you so much, Mayor. Chief Arredondo, anything to add to the relationship that you have with the council? And
Madam Chair, I think from my end, I think your frame has frozen a little. Oh, okay, there you're back. Oh. Okay.
Am I back? Okay.
Yeah, you're back. No, I would say that that the design, the way it's currently is we have 5 precinct inspectors, and for better intent purposes, they are really kind of like the chiefs of those geographical areas throughout our city. And so there's that natural relationship that those inspectors have with their council persons. And so there's a lot of relationship and communication that they do on that level. But as chief, I'm responsible for the overall direction and vision of the department and that ranges from a lot of things in terms of our culture and our how we're moving forward with our trainings and all of those things. And so me being able to have one person to directly report to helps for an efficient and effective operations. We will also at times experience major events that take place, and we will not always have the luxury of time to consult and confer, and so and also for the safety of our 400,000 plus residents. So it's important for me to be able to report directly to one person, that being obviously the mayor. And at the end of the day, my responsibility is for the safety and well-being of our residents, businesses, and visitors. And so it's helpful for me to have that one point of contact and leader through the mayor.
Great. Thank you so much, Chief, and thank you, Mayor. Moving to the next question, and again, starting with the Mayor, this is a bit of a longer question, but how many sworn officers are actually available to work right now? What do you believe should be a minimum staffing level that would balance community safety with violence prevention? And more generally, what is your assessment of the minimum funding provision now in the charter? Does it belong in the charter as is, or in the alternative, do you have a recommendation about it, either to propose an alternative provision or elimination of the provision altogether? There's about probably 5 questions in there, and so feel free to divide it up as you see fit. Mayor, understanding that you may not have the answer specifically about the officers, or maybe you do, but I'll start with you first, and Chief Arredondo, feel free to jump in as needed.
How about I'll give my best crack at a couple of these, and then Chief Arredondo, please feel free to correct me if my numbers aren't as up to date as the ones that you have. The most recent information that I've seen is that we've seen about 100 officers that have there's been attrition of about 100 officers, either through resignation or retirement in some form, and so that would leave us, Chief, somewhere around 780 or 770 is somewhere in there, I'm guessing. Okay, well, I mean, you could probably give the more accurate number.
Yes.
Okay. And what we have had to do over the last several weeks is divert officers from subdivisions within MPD back to doing the more traditional work of 911 response and investigations. So they've been shifted from like community outreach or a number of the other, PAL is another one. I'm sure the chief can kind of go through the different divisions that have been shifted back. And it's just because, these are, we have seen an uptick in violent crime, and it has been necessary that we retain that sort of fundamental aspect of when you call 911, we have people answer in a timely fashion. So that's the first question. The assessment of the minimum funding within the charter. I kind of put on my legal hat a little more with this one, and you can have adamant positions as to what the final figure should be as to the number of officers that should be within our department. And I believe, two different people could have vastly different opinions as to the number of officers that should ultimately be in the department, and they could both simultaneously agree that a minimum number should not be within the charter. I don't know the full history as to how that provision was inserted in the charter. I believe that it was some agreement. Perhaps someone can tell me here the history of it, but I believe it was some sort of agreement or compromise, or I don't know, about 30 or 40 years ago, involving the union. But we don't have a minimum number of CPED employees or individuals handling payroll or people filling potholes, and so no, I'm not for a minimum number. Within the charter. Now, even right now, it is clear that at times we do not have the number of officers necessary to respond to 911 calls or unrest, in the timely manner that we need to be. But to the extent that those on the council or otherwise would argue, or the Charter Commission, I believe, is actually the entity that put forward the ballot amendment that included just simply taking that minimum number out. I think it makes sense from a legal perspective. And that what that does, by the way, is it would have the discussion about the full discussion of staffing to simply take place during budget conversations, which I believe is the correct venue.
That's great. Thank you so much, Mayor. Chief Arnado.
Yes, Madam Chair. So to the mayor was the numbers are actually slightly lower than the total sworn of. Mayor, I think we're at about 735 today. I also want to take the time, Madam Chair, to explain and be very clear for you and the other commissioners and those listening in that as the question states, how many sworn officers are actually available to work right now, that would include me. That would include our detectives. And so I think a lot of our communities are really trying to piece that down to, if I call 911, how many officers in uniform are available to respond to those calls? That number is lower. So that number to date as we stand is probably right around 500. And so, but I also want to just, as the mayor had stated, we have seen significant decreases in the size of our department this past year. The mayor noted some of these are through normal attrition separations, but some of these are through other types of leaves. So what that has done, quite frankly, is it's at the time being, it's creating the police department that I didn't want to have, and that's one-dimensional, meaning that at the end of the day, it's focusing on our core focus is patrol and investigations. I have to make sure that when our residents pick up the phone to call 911, we have a squad car available, but I also have to ensure that our victims of crime have an investigator there to investigate what has occurred to them. We have done other things throughout the history of this department that have been very good. Other units, the mayor mentioned some of those, Police Activities League, our Community Engagement Team, VCAT, there's a lot of acronyms, but a lot of these other things. While they weren't required, we did them because they offered a wonderful service to our community. As the department size shrinks, those are being deactivated, as the mayor mentioned, and I'm placing those back into those core functions of patrol and investigation. So I will also say that we're sitting here close to the month of October approaching us. I don't know. That number is very fluid. I mentioned it's around 500, 510 or so today. If we should continue to lose more of our personnel, and I'm consulting with the mayor every day or every week on this here, we will get to a point where it's critical in terms of the public safety and our response. And I will, there's a certain number where I will absolutely have that conversation with the mayor. Because again, we're downsizing the department, so to speak, and those two core functions, which are going to continue. But if we get to a point where we should start to see numbers that we haven't seen in terms of attrition numbers that we haven't seen in quite some time, I have to make sure that we have contingency options in place just for that. The mayor mentioned the priority one calls. We have to make sure that those are being answered. We have to be able to respond to incidents that should occur, whether it's unrest, the incident which occurred a couple of weeks ago downtown Minneapolis. We have to have the bodies available to that, and the business owners who want the report taken for a break-in or just responding to any sorts of things. So anyway, that's where we're at right about now. So those men and women available to respond to 911 calls, we're right at about 500 or so.
Okay. And
if I could add, sorry, Madam Chair. As the chief mentioned, there is a substantial impact to losing the numbers through attrition that we've lost in the last. I mean, there is an impact to having a multi-dimensional police department that's doing this other work. As I mentioned, we had to abandon it. That's not because we wanted to. The other work that these police officers were previously doing was excellent work, engaging with community, as the chief mentioned, having a multifaceted, multidimensional department where you are building out those relationships is essential. We have had to divert them because simply couldn't do it all. There is an impact, and to be clear, really clear, saying that we can get rid of the minimum number in the charter does not mean that we are advocating or anybody's advocating to decrease the number of officers below that figure. That is not at all the case. So some people may advocate for that. Some people may advocate for more. I'm only saying that the discussion is best had through the budgetary process. And I fully understand the impediments that we see due to the attrition that has taken place over the last several months.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Mayor, for that addition. Chief Arredondo, is it accurate to say or safe to say that anything below that 500 number that you mentioned to be able to respond to the 911 calls would be an issue or a point of concern where you would notify the mayor?
Madam Chair, yes, so I don't often talk out of school, the conversations that I brief the mayor on daily in terms of public safety, but yes, we have to, and myself and the mayor, we have contingency plans set up in place, which quite frankly would include triaging calls. If that number continues to fall below that, we are in discussions regarding what calls we may no longer be able to take. It may also, in terms of, I talked about investigations, what cases we'll have to prioritize as investigators. And so, public community safety is kind of this ecosystem. Patrol is one of those, investigations is one of those. There's data as it relates to police trust that if victims and communities feel that their cases are not getting the required attention that they need and deserve, that in and of itself can start to erode the public trust. And so again, as the mayor noted, if we start to fall below a certain number, we had conversations about what those contingency plans are, and it could be triaging of calls, prioritizing of different cases, and quite frankly, helping out some of our partners. One of the things that we've been having to do more currently when we've had some incidents that have sparked some unrest in our city is mutual aid. That is not something that you always want to go to. It is nice that we have that type of partnership with some of our surrounding agencies, but if our department should continue to shrink, that will be something that I as chief will have to rely upon a lot more. So again, those are conversations, great question. Those are conversations that me and the mayor are having quite frequently.
Great. And before I move on to the next question, Mayor, I just want to do a time check with you. I've heard that you have a hard stop. Are we getting close to that time frame?
I honestly have a stop that is largely based on when I'm called from the other room, so it could be fairly soon. I might have another 10 minutes or so.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, great. We do have a question from one of our commissioners here, and I'm just going to read it, and then Commissioner Metke, if I don't read it correctly or get captured, please feel free to ask it. The question, which is in the chat for the mayor and Chief Arredondo, how is the 500 working with 500 plus shootings, 59 deaths, and growth in violent crime? How does the violent crime compare to violent crime last year?
I'll let Chief, I'll let you take this one, but the chief has consistently come to me to inform me that it is getting increasingly difficult. Go ahead, Chief.
Yeah, Madam Chair, to the mayor. Commissioner Metke, yes, we have been experiencing this year has been very tough on our city in terms of violent crime. As pointed out, our homicide rate, unfortunately, has more than doubled what it was the same time last year. In the shootings, we oftentimes, and rightfully so, homicides get a lot of the attention, but the vast volume of shootings that occur in our city impact so many. We are, again, well over 400 plus shootings. When we also think about the size and staffing of our police department, when we have one homicide or we have one shooting, it is not just one officer and one squad car that responds to that. It pulls in so many resources to that one incident. And if we have, as Commissioner Metke mentioned, hundreds of shootings just in 1 year, and the year's not over yet, that again, that requires a lot of resources, and it has impacted. It can, and by the way, for our community at large, how that also, where they see that impacting them is if our officers, for example, in 3rd Precinct are responding to a shooting, but a neighbor's calling in about a burglary and wondering why the delay in time was so long, that is one of the reasons we're seeing, again, an increase. Minneapolis is not alone. We're seeing other cities across the country that are experiencing a rise in violent crime. But yes, to Commissioner Mecky's point, absolutely, there's the violent crime has certainly impacted our response times, and also, again, it impacts trust. If we don't have adequate number of staffing for our residents and business owners and visitors to see a squad car respond quickly, that can leave an impression.
And Commissioner Mecke, you have a follow-up?
Kind of a follow-up comment more than a question. I think that's really good to clarify, Chief, because as you know, there's a lot of public rhetoric out there about the police not responding in a timely fashion and doing it intentionally and trying to sabotage the work of change, and you can't do more with less. And so I think there's little acknowledgement out in the public, at least in my work, what I see, that when you have one homicide, all the squads could end up showing up there, and then there are none available. And I think the more that we can do to publicize that and clarify that, the more important it is. But you just can't do more with less. That's why I asked the question.
And Madam Chair, to Commissioner Metke, that's a great point. I'm going to ask, if I can, Madam Chair, the Deputy Chief Forrest, who oversees our Patrol Bureau, to just kind of give a snapshot of what his folks are seeing out there. The other thing I also want to say, too, where this impacts, when we have this type of violent crime, it also means oftentimes that we're holding over those men and women, those officers. They're going to run past their shift times. And I am a huge proponent, and the mayor has been so supportive in his time as mayor, of wellness for our men and women. We recognize that our communities suffer trauma. We have not talked often in years about the trauma that our men and women can at times suffer, and we need to make sure that they're providing, and their families are getting the resources that they need. But you can imagine if our workforce is responding to that number of shootings and homicides, it absolutely will have an impact on our community, the response times, our officers oftentimes having to work overtime. And if I could, Deputy Chief Forrest, just from what you're seeing out there this year, if you had some highlights on that.
Yes, sir. As you discussed, a lot of the challenges we're facing are centered around an increased violent crime response load. And you were accurate in that we have over 400 gunshot wound victims this year. That's an increase as our last numbers of 89%, and even more concerning is that we track these numbers aggregated through the week. This would be week 39 for the year that we're tracking. And the amount of gunshot wound victims we've had through week 39 is more than the same time period of 2018 and 2019 combined, which should, I'd say, put an emphasis as Jana so correctly pointed out, in terms of the amount of resources it takes to respond to these types of calls. Our homicides are up 76%, 58 versus 33, I believe, in 2019. That's again more resources, and the chief and the mayor have done an excellent job of trying to keep our patrol bureau staffed as full as we can to maintain the 911 response. The important thing to keep in mind, and the chief and those of us on the executive team have pointed out, is that it is making the department very one-dimensional, in the sense that we're responding to crimes, we're investigating crimes that already happened, And in order to maintain those numbers the best we can, we're having to take from units and divisions that were designed and functioned to try to get ahead of those crimes, to focus on the most violent people, or to focus on some of the community outreach and causatory reasons of why we're having the crimes, and even some of our more flexible investigative resources that we could utilize to spend the time to do some of the deep dives and go after and build some of the more complicated cases against some active people that are challenging to do so. So as we start, let's say, kind of shrinking into and covering these patrol needs, we're going to be losing a lot of those functions, and that's not going to do well for, I think, the what we all want to be involved in, and that is the work that really prevents the crime from happening in the first place. And so, as the chief pointed out, we have just a slightly over 500 personnel on patrol. Our goal is to maintain every single one of them and keep them in as supposedly as, you know, good state of mind and with wellness, because we need every single one of them. So that is our main goal moving forward is wellness and retention, and trying to do the best with these personnel and still going out there and solving problems and being responsive and there for the community. That's so key.
Great.
And I just, Madam Chair, if I could just quickly to Commissioner Mackey's point again too. She brings up a great point. We have heard that narrative that our folks are not responding. All indications that I see are our men and women are out there, and they're doing such a great job professionally getting out there, trying to respond as quickly as they can. Obviously, in light of a pandemic, a rise in violent crime that we haven't seen in years, they're doing some admirable work. So thank you for raising that.
Yes,
Right.
thank you.
And Commissioner Mackey, is your question related to what Deputy Chief Forrest has asked, or related to this topic? I wanted to just be respectful of the mayor's time and ask one last question about the budget, but wanted to make sure we asked your question connected to the responses that have been given.
So you can go ahead and ask the mayor. My question is a follow-up to Lieutenant Four.
Okay. Great. So hold it or put it in the chat so we don't lose it. And before we lose the mayor, I'm actually going to skip, Mayor, to question number 7, which is related to the budget. And then we'll come back to question number 6 that's directed to Chief Arredondo. So, Mayor, how does the 2021 budget and draft form to date reflect the need and desire for police reform? Are there new priorities or programs added to the budget from last year, more shifting from the police budget, or expansion of reformed programs within the police department budget? Plans to add non-licensed personnel for responding when appropriate to 911 calls, or to expand co-responder programs, or any other such personnel to facilitate your alternative vision?
Thank you. The answer is yes. Before I get into the aspects of the budget, number of policy areas that have already been changed, reform measures that have already taken place that the chief and I have moved forward. I've already mentioned the overhaul of our use of force policy. That has changed. The reporting requirements surrounding both de-escalation as well as use of force are far more rigorous now. We want to make sure that we're tracking de-escalation techniques that have been used, why they were used, if they weren't used, why they weren't used, and also we've expanded the number of forms or types of force that require some form of reporting, both in written form as well as to the supervisor. We've changed the body camera policy a bit again. There's a number of policy changes even beyond that I won't get into, but those happen outside of the budget process because they're within the policy itself. But there are a number of new programs and priorities in the recommended 2021 budget that really reflect the need for this transformative change that we're talking about. The 2021 budget, by the way, is just sort of the beginning of these types of new investments and transformative changes. There's a 911 work group that is going to be coming forward with recommendations. There's a policing staffing study that should better help us determine what number of officers we need responding to calls, and we need them in ground. We need to do some of these additional divisional work. There's the public safety transformative task forces that are presently underway. And then there's a reimagined public safety community engagement process that's also happening. As far as in the budget, the funding aspects, we invested $230,000 for an early intervention system. This may or may not, at the end of the day, require city funds, but if we can get it funded externally. But this is a system that I think will better help us track officers and make changes in real time, so that we're better responding to the needs both of the officer as well as the public. And we're able to find out about some of these problem areas before a major crisis takes place. This is something that both the chief and I very much support, and I think will ultimately help with accountability measures, but also just tracking in general. You know, you need good data in order to make good decisions, and this helps us gain the necessary data. We're expanding funding for the Office of Violence Prevention. So it's $2.5 million for the Minneapolis Violence Interrupters Initiative on an ongoing basis. That initiative will have around 5 team leads. These are community members that have been hired that have a real deep connection with the neighborhood, with families, with those who are group or gang involved. And then each one of those 5 team leads is then going to have 15 to 20 people under them. And so this violence interrupter method can work with our police department to in some cases supplement their efforts, in other cases to gather and to help quell and cool off tense situations before they move towards retaliation. And this Violence Interrupters Initiative is going to be done through our Office of Violence Prevention. There's ongoing funding of $455,000 that expands the co-responder. This is the mental health co-responder program by an additional $230,000. And again, we want to bring this compassionate response across the city. Mental health co-responders have been shown to be successful. I will note that they, at least my understanding thus far, they generally will not go out to 911 calls without an officer present, at least initially, to determine whether the call or the event is safe. We've allocated another $300,000 to the Race Equity Division to support racial healing. $50,000 is being allocated to the City Attorney's Office for criminal justice reform work. $85,000 to support the city's partnership with The Link. $250,000 and 3 FTEs to transfer theft report. So this would be theft report only calls from MPD 2311. And then ongoing funding of $300,000 to support the continued implementation of the recommendations from the opioid task force that we had. And that's the first step hospital-based overdose intervention system. There's a number of other initiatives as well. Also of obviously substantial interest within this budget, there's a citywide hiring freeze. Now that hiring freeze applies across the board to all departments. It does apply to the MPD, but it is not exclusive to it. Now, the hiring freezes can have waivers. And there have been waivers already that have a series of waivers that we have already agreed to. There will be 3 recruiting classes that will be coming on board next year. And granted, I do want to hear what the staffing study says, but I also anticipate that we should have those waivers for those 3 recruiting classes granted, as we will be seeing additional attrition. And as the chief pointed out, the numbers are such that the numbers are such that with more decreases, it'll be felt in even more so. And so as the attrition takes place, it's necessary that we're, bringing in these officers, but also bringing them in with the right mindset. And I'll note that our chief spends, I don't know, like a month, chief, on interviewing personally every single one of them. And I don't know any other chief that does that to the extent that Chief Arredondo with a department of this size.
Great. Thank you so much, Mayor. Chief Arredondo, anything you want to add or just emphasize that the Mayor stated?
No, I just to Madam Chair, to the Mayor's point, there's been a lot of we have not just this year started talking about other alternatives to policing. Many of the things that the Mayor noted, the co-responder model is one that has shown, I don't have all of the actual data for it, but in the time that they've been out there working has really shown great results. The primary goal of the co-responder is to keep those who are experiencing crisis or mental health issues in their homes at the end of the day, and to get some of those wraparound services that the health professional can do for that as well. And so there's other things that we've really been looking at. The Mayor's talked about some of those. The Mayor's been a stalwart and leader in terms of housing, and making sure we as a city can do our best to shelter those who may be experiencing homelessness. I will tell you that I've been championing that cause myself. I see the direct connection in terms of those who do not have housing, how that absolutely has a direct impact on what we see as community safety. And so we're going to continue to look and operate outside the box and realize where we are needed in terms of sworn armed law enforcement, but at the same time recognize that, again, this is an ecosystem. We need to make sure that people are housed. We need to make sure that those who are suffering addiction have the help and resources that they can get. Mental health issues within our community, making sure that people have those services. So we'll continue down that road.
I do want to go back up to Commissioner Metke. She had a question specifically for Deputy Chief Forrest, and then I'll move on to question number 6.
Thank you. It's sort of a threefold question to Lieutenant Forrest and the Chief. If you want to add to it, that would be great. I'm wondering, I'm going back to the tipping point. When you're talking about the load on patrol, what's the tipping point? Question number 2, do you know, are you aware, as of this date, of how many may be leaving at the end of December? Officers, patrol officers? And my third point is when you were talking about the department becoming one-dimensional, I'm concerned that I'm not hearing anything about community policing, and I'm aware that there's 2 points of view. Eliminate police, reduce the amount of police, but the bottom line is community policing builds relationships and understanding, and also is a way to get recruits from the community to diversify the police department. So I'm worried that I'm not hearing anything about community policing in any of the budget proposals or programmatic discussions, and I'm just wondering if you could speak to those 3 points, starting with Lieutenant Forrest.
Yes. Thank you for these questions. The question of the tipping point is I think organizationally, and the chief can expand a bit on this, is that we've tightened the belt about as much as we can, so to speak, in terms of finding resource or reallocating resources back into patrol positions. And this answers a bit to your later question about concerning about about community engagement and community relationships. And yes, many of these resources did have to be reallocated from community outreach type programs in order to do so. And we have said repetitively, this was something we had to do to maintain our core services. We clearly see the value in those programs and want to invest in those programs, but we do have a mandate to provide enough people when people pick up the phone and call 911 and need an emergency response. And that, along with providing some investigative follow-up to hold people accountable for crimes, are our two main mandates. But we, of course, as you and all the community engagement and community partnership work that you have done, see the excessive value in having those investments and taking the time to build those relationships within the community. And so when I say we fear we're becoming more one-dimensional, it speaks to that in the sense that we recognize that we are only as good as our partnerships. We are at our best when we are on an equal footing with the community, and that we are working with the community and for the community. And that requires time, and that requires investment, and that requires people and the ability to do so. And so as our numbers become less, and we're being forced to take from some of those areas to maintain a very real obligation of being able to maintain staffing of answering 911 calls, we recognize the challenges and in terms of how we want to interface with the community and how that really affects things moving forward. As far as what number we foresee, that is an unknown. We do not know. We're not getting, we don't get forecasted out if there's going to be a certain number of people going out on leaves. I think, generally we will, we kind of use some, and I don't know exactly the number that our finance director comes up with, but kind of what a typical year of attrition would look like in terms of people who generally will, leave a department because of retirements. The amount of leaves and different things we've seen within the last few months have been kind of thrown all those metrics out the window. So again, and I think that kind of goes back to when I discussed the utmost importance we have of doing a lot of deliberate engagement with the employees we have, and letting them know that we value every single one of them, and we need everyone here. They are so valuable to us. Chief, I don't know if you had anything you wanted to add to that.
No, I think I will probably touch on some of that in the next question. Yeah, but you know what? Let me just, Madam Chair, if I can. You mentioned a tipping point, Commissioner Medke, and so what I would say is this: we don't have any more room for any more significant losses in terms of personnel. We just don't. And so that, again, those are conversations that I'm having with the mayor. If we go back to, this will probably touch a little bit on this other question. I believe it was a year or two ago that I was asked, and the mayor had asked me to go before our council and prepare a report on our current MPD staffing. We had never done that before, certainly in the history that I had been with the department. And so I wanted to really have an open and honest, candid conversation about where we were as a department back then. What came to light was one of the things that was obviously of a concern for myself and the mayor is that over that particular year, we had 6,776 priority one calls that we could not immediately respond to. Take that into account that we had more personnel that year and we had less violent crime that year. So if we talk about today, Commissioner Medke, and you mentioned a tipping point, we have less personnel on the department today and we're dealing with more violent crime. So we've deactivated many of our units. So as chief, I don't have a whole lot of more leeway in terms of resources. So as the mayor, which I appreciate him so much, asking in his 2021 budget for 3 classes, that's vitally important because as we're sitting here, and we haven't even touched October just yet, we are going to lose more personnel. And so those numbers that I talked about earlier, and DC Forrest, Deputy Chief Forrest has mentioned, it's all hands on deck for everybody. And so tipping point, we don't have any more room. if we continue to lose more personnel. We will not become one-dimensional. We will become very thin at trying to do that. And so that will go into those contingency plans I've spoken with the mayor about, triaging certain calls, triaging certain cases. And so we don't have a whole lot of more room left. Yeah, I hope that answers it.
Commissioner, if I could just add briefly to what the chief said, determining the number of officers that we have now or even in a couple of weeks is more difficult than you would imagine, because we have officers right now that are on, for instance, some form of leave, and they may ultimately go through attrition. They may come back, and it's sometimes it's hard to tell. And so the chief kind of referenced this, and then that's part of sort of the discrepancy that you oftentimes hear in numbers. Is there's those that we have available presently, like are ready to respond to calls, and then there are those that have officially left the department, and then there's this third group. And that's where some of the discrepancy often takes place.
Great. Thank you so much, Mayor, Chief Arredondo, and Deputy Chief. I'm going to take us back a bit, and again, if you've already covered this, and I think all of you all have to a certain extent, feel free to just state that. But I'm going back to question number 6, and this is related to the kind of the minimum staffing level and the needs. I will start with Chief Arredondo. What pricing and workload model did you use to come up with the 400+ increase for staffing into 2025? If you have performance and impact metrics, may we see them? If not, direct measures.
Madam Chair, thank you for the question. So as I was asked to present what does current staffing look like for the Minneapolis Police Department back then before the council, there was a couple of considerations I did in preparing that information. One was looking at comparable size cities to Minneapolis. Another was our calls for service. I also looked at we're a very unique industry in that I still consider 40 years of age young, but we're a unique industry where if you have the vast majority of your workforce over the age of 40, that's actually an aging department. So we were looking at attrition rates, population increases, what it takes to safely handle major events. So we were looking at all of that, plus being able to have a major city police department that could still do not only the core functions of patrol and investigations, but also those other things, to have a violent criminal apprehension team, to have community engagement teams, to have all of these other things that, while not mandated, they absolutely, as Commissioner Medke mentioned, they absolutely help us to be more than one-dimensional. They help us to build those relationships and also to help bring on a department, that bring on members from our community that help in terms of inclusivity, in terms of diversity. And so that was also wellness was a huge piece to what I had presented. I looked at some of the overtime hours. If I recall from one of the data points, I looked at our first precinct mid-watch shift, a first precinct that operates primarily downtown. I believe it was from January 1st to August 30th of 2018 or 19. They were held over 200 they were basically held over about every weekend except one Friday. When we look at our folks on 10-hour shifts, and you figure if they're averaging being held over 4 hours a day, they're getting up to that 17-hour work time. You factor in the time it takes them to go home. There was data that I presented also during that study that talked about sleep deprivation. I know the mayor's talked about this in terms of wellness. The data showed that when you start working past 13, 14 hours, your body, there's a physiological thing that, and that means bad judgment on our officers. We need them healthy. And so those were some of the things that I factored into it. As the mayor noted, the city has embarked upon looking at a police staffing study to see if those numbers are right, to see if they're in line with what I was projecting. again, I don't have a degree in staffing studies, but if I had to look at what we're facing with today and all of those metrics that I talked about in terms of comparable size cities, calls for service, attrition, population increases, I would say, and certainly the mayor's leading that work in terms of proposing 3 classes this next year, I would say that we're not where we need to be, quite frankly. So,
Mayor, is there anything that you'd like to add to that?
No, I think the chief covered it well.
Okay, great. Moving on,
I probably have time for maybe one more question, and then I gotta run. Thank you.
Okay, well, you get to pick the question, if that's amenable to you. Is there a question on here that you'd like to leave the charter with before you have to exit out?
Madam Chair, if I could ask you to have him pick a hard one. Thank you.
Well, these questions are long, so I say all of them are pretty pretty hard. But I can take a look at it as well, Mayor. It may be helpful to skip down to the last question, if that's okay, because the other questions are pretty lengthy, and I think it seems like Chief Arredondo would be well versed to be able to answer them. So, would you be comfortable with the last question, number 15?
I would.
Okay. What are you, I was reading question 14. Are you willing to work in partnership with the Charter Commission going forward, particularly as you move through the community engagement process to draft an amendment that would accomplish a pathway to systemic change in the police culture?
Yes, I would, and thank you all for your service. It's greatly appreciated.
Great. Well, see, that was easy. Second. Mayor, we appreciate your time here, and I just would say if there's things that, as you're looking at the questions here after you get off the call and wanted to provide some insight into, feel free to reach out to us. We're happy to either have you back here on another call or meeting with us, or we can receive them in writing. But we appreciate your time, and thank you so much for the work that you do.
We appreciate all of you as well, and thank you for having me on. And Chief Arredondo is a clear expert in this area, and so I'm sure he'll cover us wonderfully.
Great. Thank you so much. So now, Chief, we move to you. You're in the hot seat fully, and we'll ask you all the hard questions. So I'm going to move back up to, let's see where we left off here. No, we got to 7. Number 8, question number 8. What state law changes would assist the MPD in facilitating systemic change? Related to that question, has there been a determination of the legislative priorities related to public safety for this year? If so, what are the ones for which you'll be advocating for? And maybe this was the question for the mayor as well, but we can always come back and ask him. Do you have some insight into this question?
Madam Chair, thank you for that. So a couple of the state law changes that I think the mayor has touched on and certainly I've touched on is the importance of arbitration. There were some recent changes at the state as it relates to arbitration. I don't think they went as far enough. I believe that's also been the sentiment of the Minnesota Police Chiefs Association as well. But we'll continue to keep working in that area. One of the things I talked about the importance of health and wellness, certainly with our police department. The mayor has done a wonderful job of allocating dollars to help us in that area. I would like to see from a statewide perspective, the state allocating funding to police agencies across the state in terms of helping to help us in that area, and not only the wellness resources for our men and women, but also their families. We know that their families go along with them on this journey. And so that is one of the things. I will say also from the state level / Minnesota Police Officer Standards and Training, the licensing body for all law enforcement officers in the state of Minnesota, the MPD has actually led some great work, and there's been some credit or training that has been around procedural justice. And procedural justice, making sure it's under the framework of giving community members and those we work with a voice, building spaces of trust, having neutral engagements and treating others with respect. There's cultural components into that as well, competency components in that as well. Ongoing de-escalation training. We're fortunate that we are able to go above and beyond what is required by the state in that regard. But so there's some more work that we'll continue to try to make sure that our intergovernmental relations team carries over to the state. But that's what I would say for that question right now.
Great. Thank you for that. I'm going to move us to the next question. Are there details you can share at this time regarding the outcomes/effects of the 2019 co-responder program? And you may have already touched on this, but we want to ask just in case.
Yeah. Again, it's been a great model. Again, the goal has been to keep those in our communities who have been struggling with mental health and crisis, to keep them in their homes, to also provide that follow-up care. So if Madam Chair, if I could, if Deputy Chief Force might have some more information regarding that, if you do, Deputy Chief Force.
Yes, Chief, and some of this might be a bit of a recap. I know in a previous meeting I touched a bit on some of the data that we had as a result of the 2019 and also the co-responder program in itself, and some of the data. Let me get down to what we were looking at, and it really kind of touches on a couple different points. One is a 911 response call, and that is when a co-responder unit responds to assist a dispatch squad on a 911 emergency call that comes in from dispatch. These are predominantly categorized as emotionally disturbed person calls, but also might be recognized. They may come in as something else initially and then be determined later to be an emotionally disturbed person call. And then secondly is a follow-up call. And that is something where the co-responder unit, they conduct follow-up as titled with a client, either from a previous contact that they had already had on one of these 911 calls or maybe a previous follow-up call, or also a reference from officers or from outside of their hours. So they may, again, as I said, these are based on data, information that the co-responder unit receives from patrol officers, our crime prevention specialist staff, or even the community that requests that the co-responder unit take a look at somebody to ensure that they're receiving the appropriate mental health resources and services. And it's exceptionally important that we want to make sure that we are getting people that, like as discussed, the wraparound services that end up giving people the help that they need, so we don't end up coming back repetitively. In 2019, we had about 2,270 total contacts out in the field. We had, these were also these were, again, through 911 calls or follow-up, 1,093 911 calls were responded to, and about slightly over 1,177 were follow-up. Although the remain at home category is not generally the most predominant outcome for our 911 response with co-responders, in some places it's very close, if not the highest. In the 4th precinct, there was the most common determination that our co-responders came to was being able to leave them at home. The most likely one is either hospital or crisis. That becomes because of the fact that most often on these dispatched calls, there is already an emergency going on. These are not our follow-up calls or trying to provide further services. There's generally there is a predicating emergency event. But it's very promising to see that in most precincts, it is very, very close second, or if not the most common determination is being able to leave people in the home. The amount of arrests that we make is extraordinarily negligible. Some precincts it was 0, and the most I think that we came in one precinct was 5 in 1 year. Again, out of 2,270 total contacts. That, is there any further questions anyone has regarding that?
I don't have any further questions. I'm not sure if folks, if you do, if you could indicate them in the chat or raise your hand. And we'll move on to the next question, and which is question number 10. Have programs within the police department been transferred to the Office of Violence Prevention or other city departments, particularly recently? If so, what programs have been transferred? Have such transfers been helpful for managing public safety, or have they damaged the MPD's ability to provide for public safety? And have such transfers, if any, freed up MPD's budget, or has funding moved out of the MPD's budget along with the programs? It's a very loaded question. I know you all have talked a bit about some of the programs, but specifically as it relates to the transfer and the budget, that would be helpful. Chief Elizondo?
Yes, Madam Chair. So thank you for the question. There have not been any specific MPD programs transferred to the Office of Violence Prevention. We continue to work closely with the Office of Violence Prevention, most notably the Group Violence Intervention Program, where we work closely with Director Cotton, those credible messengers who are out there to try to reduce and prevent group violence. And so, I was looking at the transfer question of it. Yes, and as the mayor may have indicated already, he has already looked at the 2021 budget, allocating $2.5 million to the Office of Violence Prevention to again assist and help those efforts there. There were funds that had, I believe, the 2020 budget final. I believe it might have been the final markup of that, where there were funds that were also transferred to the Office of Violence Prevention as well. But in terms of actual programs transferred, to date, that has not occurred.
Great. Thank you for that, Chief. And funding, just as a follow-up, has any funding been moved out of the budget?
Madam Chair, yes. So I want to say that at the last cycle of the 2020 budget, there may have been anywhere from 1.1 to 1.8 million. And then again, as the mayor indicated for the 2021 budget, he's already looking at 2.5 million. So yes, there has been funding that has been removed from the MPD budget over to that OVP. Yes.
Great. Thank you for that. I believe Commissioner Garcia has a question.
I do. Thank you. Thank you, Chief. Thanks for being here. With that question, notwithstanding any potential future changes to the charter, while programs may not be formally transferred, are there, and this may be a 2/3-parter. First, are there any intentional efforts to collaborate with the Office of Violence Prevention and other related city departments in terms of actual coordination, regular coordination meetings and planning meetings? Specifically, if I may give a plug to, in doing so, modeling changes to culture and cooperation across the board, whatever differences may have existed as we went into the charter amendment votes. I indeed hope that everyone is coordinating and collaborating in good faith on behalf of the residents of Minneapolis. So I think modeling these types of communication and coordination is essential. And then my second part is, while there has been funding also going to other state or city department areas, is there intentional planning and coordination with you, MPD, about while funding goes someplace else, that to ensure perhaps that programming kind of dovetails and feathers in to your overall mission, so that in a holistic sense, while it may not be MPD funding, in a holistic sense, it's all trying to achieve the same goal and get on the same page. Thank you very much.
Madam Chair, to Commissioner Garcia, thank you so very much for that thoughtful question. Am I still with the group here? Testing.
You are.
Oh, okay. Madam Chair, to Commissioner Garcia's questions. So yes, we absolutely have, and I have intentional efforts to build and strengthen those relationships with other city enterprise departments. I mentioned the Office of Violence Prevention, but also working closely with Director David Rubador's teams from the Neighborhood Community Relations team. They have been instrumental on several different areas throughout our city. Most recently, they have been very helpful if you have been following 30th in Chicago and bringing together communities to have very intentional, authentic dialogue in terms of what that space looks like moving forward. NCR has also been very helpful for the MPD over the past several years as it relates to when we, this is pre-COVID, but when we would have community gatherings in spaces, making sure that such things as interpreters were there to represent our communities, make sure that flyers and mailings were in those languages that were spoken in those communities. They have done a great job in terms of our outreach with our indigenous people. So that's one area. Public health. We continue to work and lean on public health. Obviously, pandemic now, I mean, there's a lot of things that are impacting us. Some of you are certainly aware of when we've had many of our the homeless encampments around our city, those experiencing homelessness. Just this morning and throughout the last several weeks over in South Minneapolis near Hiawatha, our Lieutenant Grant Snyder has been working closely with public health and CPED and other folks to try to really, how do we bring dignity to the folks out there, but at the same time trying to make sure that those who are unsheltered have decent places to really be protected and be sheltered. So we absolutely will continue to work with those enterprises. And Commissioner Garcia, we need that. As you mentioned, community safety is a holistic approach. We cannot do it. I'll be the first to tell you. The police department's not going to be able to do this all on our own. So we need the value and talent of those other city enterprise leaders. A couple of other things in terms of just with the MPD. For those of you who may not know, it was back towards the tail end of then Mayor Betsy Hodges. She had asked me, I came in my role as the interim chief at the time, and she said, Rondo, is there anything within this budget now that you've inherited that you would want to see differently? And I said, yes, I talked about this creation of having a community navigators. And so for those of you on the line, when she originally asked me, I asked for at least 24. After she laughed hysterically, she said, well, I'll give you 6. And so, but I said, I will take them. And they continue to do great work. And those community navigators have been working with those other OVP, NCR, our public health folks. They've been out there at the Wall of the Forgotten and other places throughout our city. And so I'm a firm believer in that holistic approach, Commissioner Garcia, that you mentioned, and we'll continue to do that moving forward. And so thank you for that very thoughtful question.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm going to move to the next question here. We have a similar question regarding transfers of programs with respect to community outreach functions. Have such programs been transferred to other departments, or are there plans to do so? If so, have the consequences or impacts of such transfers on MPD been considered or understood not only for the coming year but also for the future? I know that you and the mayor talked a bit about, making some decisions on responding into calls versus, some of the outreach and engagement work that pre-COVID and pre-civil unrest you all were doing. So if you could speak more to that related to this question, that would be great.
Yes, Madam Chair. To that question, I may have the Deputy Chief Force chime in as well here. So one of the things that I know that there has been a working group, particularly related to the 911, 311. What types of calls, again, can be triaged? Are there certain enterprises within the city that can help and respond to those types of calls? And again, as we look at the department and we look at the impacts of staffing, we may absolutely do more in terms of some of those contingency planning and seeing what other enterprises within the city can take on some of those roles as well. So, Deputy Chief Force, do you have anything to add to that?
Yes, sir. That is, you're 100% accurate with that. I mean, we are very much engaged with the 911 working group, which is really designed to try to see if there are alternatives to just sending police to some of these calls and what that might look like. And the whole goal is to identify situations or circumstances or different things that I think that police emergency response is not necessarily the best response. And how can we either go about utilizing things such as 311 to maybe take reports on things that might free up some response, but then also looking at doing deep dives in terms of mental illness. And there's a lot that needs to move forward with this. Ideally, the mechanism we would like for mental health response doesn't exist as of yet. And the best kind of cooperative response we have is the co-responder program that still requires some police interaction, but it's a lot more specialized and holistic than just a uniformed squad going. Additionally, we've looked at that also surrounding the opioid epidemic, addiction, homelessness, and those are areas that we continue to explore.
Great. So we're at 6:02, and I'm sure folks are ready for dinner or just to be done on video calls for the day, including us as charter commissioners. So we want to be respectful of your time. There are 3 questions that we didn't get to. The mayor did touch base on the last question, and I wanted to intentionally ask him that. If you all have, wanted to take an opportunity to respond to those in writing and submitting those through the clerk's office, that would be great. But I think at this point we are going to conclude the interview portion of this. Just wanted to say, we already said to the mayor, thank you, but again, publicly, thank you for your time. Chief Arredondo, thank you for your time and the work that you're doing. Deputy Chief Forrest, thank you so much for your time as well. And so now we'll move to the third part of the agenda, which is next steps. Commissioner Rubenstein, do you have next step options for us?
I just wanted to mention, Commissioner Newborn, that our next meeting is in 2 weeks. And at that time, Commissioner Lucero of the Minnesota Department of Human Rights is going to give us something of an update on the investigation and what's happening there. And we'll also have people from the Office of Racial Equity in the city. And so I think we'll be looking at all these issues from a racial justice lens. So I am looking forward to a very engaging session and wanted to add thank you to Chief Arredondo and Deputy Chief Forbes and the mayor, and just to thank you for a most interesting session and for your time today.
Great. Commissioner Cohen, it seems like you have your hand raised. Did you have a question?
Kozak.
Oh, I'm so sorry. The K's always get me. Commissioner Kozak, I apologize. Yes.
Madam Chair, that's just fine. I wanted to certainly thank the chief, the deputy chief, and the mayor. This is a very, very informative and illustrative session. But I had when I read the paper this morning, I saw an article, an op-ed from an officer from I believe, the 3rd Precinct. And we've heard from the city council, from the mayor, and the chief, and others who have given their time. And I know we're going to hear, as Commissioner Rubenstein said, we're going to hear from folks in 2 weeks. But I thought, given what I read about in the paper, that I would like to hear from the regular officer's perspective. And I know that the lawyer for the Federation, and I've talked to him, and I think that they have some interesting things to say without getting into the nitty-gritty of the negotiations with the city. But just some perspective. And for example, the question that I thought that the chief did a good job of answering, to the allegation or the suggestion that that the officers were purposely slowing down their response. And I think I would like to hear from the perspective of the regular officers, and without getting into all the details and the arguments about in the negotiations on the contract. I'd like to hear, or at least some way that we get some perspective from the officers. And I know I suggested this, Commissioner Rubenstein, Madam Chair, and we may not have time, but and I don't want to make a motion, but I'm just raising it and see if we can find some time at a subsequent meeting to at least hear, to get some of that perspective. And we can set ground rules and what's permitted to talk about and all that. But and I think we find some interesting things, as I've heard some interesting that aren't contentious, but that might have will have some bearing on the final report we give.
Great. Thank you so much, Commissioner Kozak, for that suggestion and question. So I think that what we'd like to do is connect with Commissioner and Chair Rubenstein to see and assess how that's going to whether we can, and if we can incorporate that into our work plan. And it sounds like based off of the chat, there's some interest in that, and from the other commissioners on the work group. And then Chief Arredondo will follow up with you to determine who and how that would work with talking with one of your officers. So thank you so much, Commissioner Kozak. We appreciate that, and we will get back to the group about next steps and how we incorporate that into our current work plan.
Thank you, Madam Chair, very much.
Yes, you're welcome. Okay, great. Again, see some interest in that happening. Again, thank you so much, Chief Arredondo.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Commissioners, thank you so very much.
Great, great. And with that, if there's no objections, we will now adjourn the meeting.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Great meeting.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much.
Good.